Imagine your name is Margot. You're barely a minor, and you're standing at the door of a stone cottage. Your new husband, Henrik, is approaching your marriage bed. The grass rustles beneath your bare feet with each nervous step. Candlelight flickers in the wind across his hardened face. He's nearly twice your age. Your father chose her for his 3 pigs and half an acre of barley field. With trembling hands, you clutch the coarse wool dress your mother made for this night, and her mother wore before her. Through the thin walls you can hear the harsh cheers of their drunken friends outside. They won't leave until they hear proof of the marriage. Your breath comes in short gasps. Henrik's calloused fingers reach for the leather cord around your neck, and you wonder if your mother's whispered warnings about wifely duties have truly prepared you for this cramped, smoky room, reeking of wet wool and unwashed meat. This isn't a love story. This is the reality of medieval intimacy. A world where sexual practices are shaped by superstition, religious fears, and survival instincts. A world that will seem utterly foreign to our modern understanding of love and desire. If you enjoy learning the hidden truths of history before delving into these forgotten tales of survival and suffering, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more. And please let me know where you're listening in the comments. It's incredible to me that we explore these ancient stories together, connecting time and space through our shared curiosity about the past from different parts of the world. The medieval bedroom was a battleground where bodies became political territories, church doctrine clashed with pagan traditions, and the most intimate moments of human life were governed by rules so bizarre and restrictive they would make modern people shudder. These weren't just personal choices. They were about eternal salvation, family honor, and, quite literally, life and death.
Let me take you back to Margot's world. The concept of marital rape didn't exist. Because women were considered property, menstrual blood was thought to be so dangerous it could kill crops. And one wrong sexual position could condemn your soul to eternal hell. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was never truly private. Society, the church, and ancient superstitions all played a role in what happened between husband and wife. When Margot married Henrik in the autumn of 1247, their union wasn't celebrated with champagne and dancing. It was a marriage sealed with bodily fluids, a process that allowed neighbors to demand proof of the marriage. The rituals of marriage and social surveillance began long before the couple touched on the wedding night. First came the bedding ceremony, where wedding guests escorted the bride and groom to their bedrooms, singing crude songs, undressing them, and then standing outside the door, listening for the sounds that would confirm the legal binding of the marriage. Henrik's friends wouldn't leave until they heard Margot's cries of pain, proof that her virginity had been broken and the marriage consummated. But this is where intimacy truly became strange in the Middle Ages. The church taught that even married couples could commit mortal sins in their own beds. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century, declared that a man who loved his wife too ardently was an adulterer. The church fathers believed that excessive pleasure, even within marriage, was a corruption of the soul. This wasn't just a theological theory, it shaped every aspect of medieval sexual practice. The great medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologia, written around 1265, laid out clear rules for married couples. Sexual intercourse was permissible only on certain days of the week, during certain seasons, and in only one position. Any deviation from man on top, woman on bottom, or face to face was considered unnatural and therefore sinful. Oral sex was completely forbidden. Sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding was also forbidden. The church calculated that if all these rules were followed, married couples could only have sex for approximately 50 days a year. Margot would have learned these rules from her mother, who in turn from the village priest. The fear of eternal damnation hung over every intimate moment. When Henrik reached out to her during Lent on a forbidden Wednesday, she faced an impossible choice: submit to her husband's will and risk her soul, or refuse and face his wrath in a world where domestic violence was not only legal, but expected. Medical beliefs and superstitions. The understanding of female sexuality in the Middle Ages was based on fundamental misconceptions that would persist for centuries. Medical texts of the period, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman sources, taught that women were fundamentally flawed men. Their genitals were simply inverted versions of male genitals. The vagina was considered an inverted penis, while the testicles were likened to internal testes. This wasn't just ignorance, it was codified medical knowledge taught in universities across Europe. These beliefs had profound consequences for how medieval people understood female desire and pleasure. Writing in the 11th century, the physician Constantine the African argued that women experienced sexual pleasure differently from men. They needed prolonged stimulation and multiple orgasms to conceive. This led to the peculiar medical belief that rape could not result in pregnancy, because the woman could not achieve the necessary pleasure. If a woman became pregnant after sexual assault, medieval courts interpreted this as indicating that she had enjoyed the experience and was therefore partly responsible. Margot's mother may have warned her about a wandering uterus. It was believed that this condition could cause sensations, insanity, and even death. The uterus could literally move within a woman's body. It could move upward to suffocate her heart, or downward to escape through her vagina. Treatments included fumigating the vagina with pleasant odors to retract the uterus, or applying foul-smelling substances to the nose to push it downward. The medieval period inherited a complex web of fertility beliefs from pagan traditions that the Church could not fully eradicate. The village sages, often branded as witches by later generations, possessed subterranean knowledge of herbs, rituals, and practices designed to increase fertility, prevent pregnancy, or induce the birth of a son. In the forests surrounding Margan's village, women gathered certain herbs under the full moon. Mint and tansy were brewed into teas that could prevent pregnancy,
but the balance between birth control and death was dangerously thin. The mandrake root, shaped like a human figure, was worn as an amulet believed to increase fertility. The root was so valuable that fake versions made from carved brioni plants were common in medieval markets. The Church officially condemned these practices as witchcraft, but even devout Christians couldn't completely abandon them. The line between folk medicine and magic was impossibly blurred. A woman might pray to the Virgin Mary for a safe birth, while simultaneously burying a piece of her last husband under her threshold to ensure future fertility. Wearing a cross, she might wear a piece of ambergris between her breasts to prevent miscarriage when attending church. Birth control in the Middle Ages was a dangerous mix of superstition, poison, and desperation. Women were taught to jump backwards 7 times after intercourse or drink wine mixed with crushed bees to prevent pregnancy. More dangerous were potions made with mercury, lead, and other toxic substances, which often killed the woman along with the potential pregnancy. The consequences of an unwanted pregnancy were severe. In a world without reliable birth control, women faced the constant threat of death during childbirth. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. 1 in 3 women died during or shortly after childbirth. For unmarried women, pregnancy often meant social destruction, exile, or death. Although the practice of infanticide was officially condemned, it was widely understood as a desperate woman's last resort. Marriage, virginity, and social honor were waged like medieval marriage negotiations, military campaigns, where bodies were the primary battleground. When Margot's father arranged her marriage to Henrik, her virginity was literally her dowry, more valuable than any gold or animal he could offer. The hymen became a currency exchanged between families as proof of their daughter's purity and their own prestige. The wedding night was not just about consummating the marriage. It involved publicly verifying the bride's virginity. Blood-stained sheets were displayed to the crowd as proof of the marriage's legitimacy. If no blood was visible,
The bride could be sent back to her family in disgrace, branded an unclean woman, or even killed for fraud. The pressure on young brides was immense. Some would secretly make their fingers bleed or hide chicken blood to mimic the proof their new families demanded. However, medieval medicine's understanding of virginity was hopelessly flawed. They believed that the hymen was actually a rigid membrane that completely blocked the vaginal opening, rather than a flexible partial tissue. Its absence was considered absolute proof of sexual activity. However, it could be ruptured by horseback riding, heavy lifting, or simply by natural variations in anatomy. The Church's doctrine of consummation created its own peculiar practices. A marriage was not considered legally binding until sexual intercourse had taken place. This meant that proving or disproving the consummation of the marriage became a matter of legal inquiry. Church courts would question both the husband and the examiner separately about the intimate details of their wedding night. They would examine the woman's body for signs of penetration and ask neighbors what they had heard through the walls. Sexual positions, demons, and menstruation. In the Middle Ages, sexual positions were strictly regulated by church doctrine, but the reality was much more complex. The missionary position wasn't just preferred, it was the only position that wouldn't condemn your soul to hell. The church taught that any position that placed the woman on top was unnatural because it violated the natural order of male dominance. Rear entry was considered bestial because it linked human sexuality to the mating practices of animals. But medieval literature points to a more complex reality. Fabliaux, crude comic tales, popular in medieval France, describe sexual encounters that would shock church officials. Often told by wandering bards in taverns and marketplaces, these stories reveal a shadow world where couples experimented with forbidden practices despite the threat of eternal damnation. Writing around 1184, the French poet Andreas Capellanus described elaborate courtship rituals, including detailed instructions for sexual positions and techniques. His work demonstrates that, at least among the nobility, a sophisticated understanding of sexual pleasure went far beyond the restrictive teachings of the Church. But these practices were dangerous secrets. Being discovered could mean excommunication, exile, or death.
Medieval people lived in fear of sexual demons, believed to attack people at their most vulnerable. Succubus and incubus weren't just folklore, they were accepted medical and theological truths. Church authorities taught that these demons could take human form to seduce men and women, stealing their life force through sexual intercourse. The succubus, a female demon who seduced men, was held responsible for nocturnal emission, sexual dreams, and any sexual thoughts occurring outside of marriage. Medieval theologians developed elaborate theories about how these demons operated. They believed that a demon could first take a female form to collect semen from a man, then transform into a male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen semen. Any child born from such a union was believed to be cursed or demonic. Incubus, however, posed an even greater threat to medieval women. These male demons were said to be physically stronger than humans and capable of overpowering their victims. Women who reported sexual dreams or experiences they could not explain were frequently accused of having contact with demons. The line between victim and witch was frighteningly thin. Sleep paralysis, now understood as a neurological phenomenon, was interpreted as demonic sexual assault. Men and women who woke motionless, often with a feeling of pressure on their chests, were believed to be under demonic attack. The Church prescribed elaborate exorcisms and purification rituals. However, many suspected victims were burned as witches instead. Menstruation, fertility, and class differences. The understanding of menstruation in the Middle Ages was based on centuries of fear and superstition. Menstrual blood was believed to be poison.
It was so poisonous that it could kill crops, spoil wine, and cause men to lose their sexual potency. The great Roman naturalist Plinius, whose works are still studied in medieval universities, claimed that menstrual blood could drive dogs mad and make knives lose their sharpness. During their menstrual cycles, women were considered dangerous polluters who should be isolated from normal society. They could not enter churches, prepare food, or touch sacred objects. In many villages, menstruating women were required to live in special huts, isolated from society until their bleeding stopped. The Church taught that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's original sin, making each monthly cycle a source of feminine shame. This lack of understanding about menstruation led to bizarre medical practices. Doctors believed that menstrual blood, if not properly expelled from the body, would accumulate and poison the woman from within. They prescribed bloodletting, purgations, and other dangerous treatments to balance the women's humors. Some doctors recommended sexual intercourse as a treatment for menstrual disorders, believing that male semen could neutralize the toxic effects of menstrual blood. Medieval women developed their own secret knowledge to manage their cycles. They used moss, cloth, and sheepskin as primitive menstrual protection. They tracked their cycles according to the phases of the moon and developed herbal remedies to relieve cramps and regulate flow. This knowledge was carefully concealed from male physicians and church officials, who might condemn it as witchcraft, and passed down through generations of women. The Middle Ages saw the rise of complex theories of sexual compatibility based on astrological signs, body humors, and physical characteristics. Medieval physicians believed that sexual pleasure and fertility depended on the proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors in both partners. A hot husband could be incompatible with a cold wife, leading to sexual dysfunction and infertility.
Physical examinations of potential mates were common among wealthy families. Physicians examined the bride's body for signs of her sexual temperament. Wide hips indicated fertility, while narrow hips indicated infertility. The groom's penis size and shape were analyzed for compatibility with the woman he would marry. These examinations were conducted with the same clinical impartiality used to examine animals. Church officials developed their own theories of sexual compatibility based on spiritual rather than physical characteristics. They taught that couples too closely related by blood or spiritual kinship were cursed with sexual dysfunction and monstrous offspring. Complex kinship rules meant that many medieval marriages were later annulled when previously unknown family connections were discovered. Sexuality in the Middle Ages was deeply intertwined with concepts of honor, shame, and social status. A man's sexual prowess was directly linked to his reputation as a warrior and leader. Impotence was not simply a personal failing. It was a public humiliation that could destroy a man's standing in society. The medieval French developed elaborate euphemisms for sexual dysfunction, creating a vocabulary of shame that permeated every aspect of social interaction. For women, sexual reputations were even more fragile. The slightest hint of impropriety could destroy a woman's marital prospects and the honor of her family. Medieval towns were small communities where everyone knew each other's business. A woman seen speaking to a man who was not her husband or relative could be branded an unclean woman. Standards of female behavior were so restrictive that even married women lived in constant fear of gossip and accusation. The medieval legal system of law, morality, and social control reflected these sexual anxieties in its treatment of rape, adultery, and sexual assault. Rape was defined not as a crime against the woman, but as a crime against the man who possessed her, her father, her husband, or her lord. Punishment for rape varied dramatically depending on the social status of both the victim and the perpetrator. A nobleman who raped a peasant woman might pay a small fine, while a peasant who raped a noblewoman faced torture and death. Adultery was punished even more severely, but only for women. A married woman who had sex with a man other than her husband could be killed by her husband without legal consequences if caught.
Medieval legal codes gave husbands the right to kill their adulterous wives and lovers if caught in the act. Men, on the other hand, were generally free to have sex with unmarried women, prostitutes, or their own servants without legal consequences. The Middle Ages saw the development of elaborate courtship rituals that would influence European culture for centuries. The tradition of courtly love, popularized in the poetry of the troubadours, created a parallel world where sexual desire became a spiritual quest. These romantic ideals were primarily a literary fantasy enjoyed by the nobility. However, they had a profound impact on how medieval people understood the relationship between love and sexuality. The tradition of courtly love taught that true love could only exist outside of marriage. A knight's devotion to his lady had to remain forever unfulfilled, existing in a constant state of longing that purified the soul through suffering. This created a strange distinction between purely functional marital sexuality and purely spiritual romantic love. The reality of courtship in the Middle Ages was much more pragmatic. Among peasants, young people might have some choice in their marriage partners. However, economic considerations always trumped personal choice. A village girl might fall in love with a blacksmith's son, but if the miller offered her father better terms, she might be forced to marry a man she knew. Medieval betrothal practices included rituals designed to test the compatibility of potential spouses.
In some regions, engaged couples were allowed to sleep together, fully clothed, separated by a board called a cuddling board. This practice allowed families to assess the couple's physical compatibility without risking pregnancy or violating church doctrine on premarital sex. Body, spirit, and contradictory practices. The Middle Ages inherited a complex tradition of sexual magic and fertility rituals from earlier pagan cultures. These practices were driven underground by Christian persecution, but they never completely disappeared. Medieval peasants often continued to practice ancient fertility rituals, often incorporated into Christian celebrations or folk medicine. The May Day celebration retained its strong sexual connotations despite the church's attempts to suppress it. Young people would spend the night in the woods, ostensibly to gather flowers and branches to decorate the village. In reality, May Day was an opportunity for sexual experimentation and flirtation outside the normal constraints of village life. Many pregnancies were thought to have resulted from encounters on May Day. This, in turn, led to an increase in births in February. Wedding celebrations included numerous fertility rituals designed to ensure the couple's reproductive success. The bride might be showered with grains or nuts to encourage pregnancy. The marriage bed was blessed with holy water. However, it could also be secretly prepared with herbs and talismans believed to increase fertility. These practices represented a desperate attempt to control reproduction in a world where infant mortality rates were devastating and family survival depended on producing healthy children. The medieval understanding of childbirth was a strange blend of Aristotelian philosophy, Christian doctrine, and folk wisdom. Medieval physicians believed that both men and women, during intercourse, produced seeds that, by uniting, created new life. They taught that the female orgasm was essential for pregnancy. This led to the tragic belief that women who became pregnant after rape must have enjoyed the experience. Medieval people developed elaborate theories to influence the sex of unborn children. They believed that during certain phases of the moon, pregnancy would produce boys, while during others, it would produce girls. The position of the stars at the time of conception was thought to influence not only the sex of the child, but also his or her personality and future prospects. Censorship and resistance. The Middle Ages saw the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of sexual control and surveillance. The Church established networks of informants who reported on the private lives of their neighbors. Confession became a tool for gathering information about intimate sexual practices. Priests would question confessors about their most intimate moments. The rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century brought new levels of sexual persecution. Suspected heretics were forced to confess not only their religious beliefs, but also their sexual practices. The interrogation manuals used by inquisitors included detailed questions about sexual positions, frequency of intercourse, and even the physical sensations experienced during sex. Medieval prisons included special punishments for sexual offenses. Women convicted of adultery could be imprisoned in cages so small they could barely stand upright, fed only bread and water, until their death. Men convicted of rape could be publicly castrated before being hanged. These extreme punishments were designed not only to punish the perpetrators, but also to terrorize the entire community into sexual harmony. The Middle Ages produced a vast literature of sexual advice and instruction, although much of it was hidden from the common people. Medical texts contain detailed descriptions of sexual positions and techniques. However, these were only available to educated physicians and wealthy patrons.
The average medieval person learned about sex through whispered conversations, folk songs, and the bitter experience of trial and error. The Church produced its own sexual literature, but this was primarily concerned with cataloging sins, not providing positive guidance. Penance manuals listed hundreds of sexual practices and their corresponding punishments. These texts reveal a fascination with sexual detail that contradicted the Church's official position on celibacy and purity. Medieval marriage manuals, written for wealthy patrons, offered a glimpse into the sexual lives of the nobility. These texts offered advice on everything from wedding night techniques to managing sexual relations during pregnancy. These revealed a sophisticated understanding of sexual pleasure, hidden from the general population, but openly practiced by those possessing privacy and discretion. The Middle Ages saw the development of increasingly elaborate methods of sexual punishment and control. Although less common than most popular culture suggests, the chastity belt represented the extreme measures some medieval people resorted to control female sexuality. These devices were not only physical restraints, but also symbols of the terror surrounding female sexual autonomy. Medieval brothels were simultaneously legal and illegal. The Church officially condemned prostitution, but secular authorities often licensed and regulated it. Medieval cities maintained official red light districts where prostitutes worked under state supervision. These women were required to wear distinctive clothing, live in designated areas, and undergo regular medical examinations. Medieval people believed that sexual practices could influence everything from the weather to the success of military campaigns. Kings and nobles consulted astrologers to learn the best times for sexual intercourse. They believed that cosmic forces present during pregnancy would influence the fate of their children. Army commanders, believing that sexual activity would deplete their warrior strength, might order their soldiers to abstain from intercourse before battle. The Middle Ages saw the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of sexual surveillance and control. Village communities developed elaborate systems of social pressure designed to regulate sexual behavior. Young people were rarely allowed to be alone, and married couples were expected to conduct their intimate lives according to community standards. In the Middle Ages, the understanding of sexual pleasure was deeply influenced by religious teachings about the nature of the soul and body. The Church taught that sexual pleasure was a trap set by the devil to distract people from spiritual contemplation. Even within marriage, excessive sexual pleasure was considered a sin that could condemn the soul to hell. Medieval people developed elaborate techniques to manage sexual desire and control their bodies. Fasting, cold baths, and physical asceticism were used to suppress sexual urges. Young people were taught to avoid situations that could lead to sexual arousal, including certain foods, music, and forms of entertainment.
The Middle Ages produced a vast underground culture of sexual transgression and rebellion. Despite the Church's attempts to control human sexuality, medieval people found ways to express their desires and pursue pleasure.
This shadow world of sexual rebellion existed alongside the official culture of repression and control. Medieval sexuality was shaped by practical concerns that modern people rarely consider. The lack of privacy in medieval homes meant that sexual intercourse often took place in spaces shared with children, servants, and extended family members. The sounds and smells of sexual activity were part of daily life in ways that shock modern sensibilities. The Middle Ages saw the development of increasingly complex relationships between sexuality and social class. The sexual privileges of the nobility were part of their broader social dominance. Lords and ladies had access to private chambers, exotic foods, and leisure time, allowing them to explore sexual pleasure in ways impossible for peasants. Medieval marriage was ultimately about survival, rather than love or sexual fulfillment. In a world with short life expectancy and high infant mortality, the primary purpose of marriage was to produce children capable of carrying on the family name and cultivating the land. Sexual pleasure was at best a secondary concern, often seen as a dangerous distraction from more pressing concerns. The Middle Ages produced some of the most restrictive sexual mores in European history, but it also saw the development of sophisticated forms of sexual resistance and rebellion. Despite overwhelming social pressure to conform to religious and social expectations, common people found ways to pursue pleasure and express their desires. Their stories remind us that sexuality is one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience, too powerful to be completely controlled by any system of authority. When we return to the stone hut of Nargotia, Henrik's hands still reaching for her in the flickering candlelight, we can understand his terror not only as a personal fear, but as the weight of an entire culture's sexual anxieties on his young shoulders. She carries the burden of religious doctrine, family honor, social surveillance, and her own desperate desire to survive in a world that offers her no protection. The Middle Ages remind us that human sexuality has always been shaped by power, fear, and social control. The peculiar practices and beliefs of medieval people now seem alien to us, but they emerged from the same basic human needs and desires that drive sexual behavior in every era. Understanding medieval sexuality helps us recognize how our own sexual culture reflected the power structures and social anxieties of our time. In the Middle Ages, privacy was never truly private. It was always public. It was always political. It was always dangerous. The bedroom was a battleground where souls were won and lost, family honor was defended or destroyed, and the most intimate moments of human life were governed by rules seemingly designed to eliminate pleasure and maximize pain. The Middle Ages produced some of the most restrictive sexual mores in European history, but it also reveals the incredible resilience of human sexual desire. Despite centuries of religious persecution, social control, and legal punishment, medieval people found ways to pursue love, pleasure, and intimate connection. Their stories remind us that sexuality is one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience, too powerful to be completely controlled by any system of authority. The strange and often disturbing sexual practices of medieval Europe were not simply the result of ignorance or superstition. They emerged from a complex interplay of religious doctrine, social structure, economic necessity, and genuine human need. Understanding these practices helps us appreciate how far we have come and how these same fundamental tensions continue to shape human sexuality today. Ultimately, the Middle Ages teach us that sexuality is always political, always dangerous, and always fundamental to human experience. The peculiarly intimate practices of medieval people were attempts to transcend these enduring tensions between desire and control, pleasure and danger, love and survival. Their struggles remind us that the quest for sexual freedom and authentic intimacy is not a modern invention, but an ancient human aspiration that transcends any particular historical moment. The candlelight still flickers on Henrik's wind-hardened face as he reaches out to young Margot. But now we understand that this moment contains the full weight of medieval sexual culture. In his trembling hands and calloused fingers, we see not just two people, but the sexual anxieties and desires of an entire civilization playing out in the most intimate space imaginable. But it's never truly private. It's never truly safe.